Official history reveres Ramses II as the ancient world's most invincible ruler. But stone, holy as it may seem, can lie right to your face. The man behind Egypt's most colossal monuments didn't build his legacy on undeniable military victories, but on pure, unadulterated state-sponsored manipulation. Etched into the temples we idolize today lies a tactical blunder so brutal it nearly wiped his empire off the map in a single afternoon. The classic image of the living god walking triumphant over the corpses of his enemies? It's a monumental fraud. This is exactly what happens when a nation's supreme leader decides to weaponize the country's entire architecture into a censorship machine, all to cover up a historic battlefield humiliation. When early Egyptologists first began translating the imposing hieroglyphs carved into the ruins of the Ramesseum, Ramses II's majestic mortuary temple, they came face to face with the tale of a bona fide superhero. The inscriptions didn't just describe a king leading his army. They depicted a living, breathing deity in all his ruthless glory. The texts detail, with almost cinematic precision for the time, how the pharaoh was surrounded and, completely alone in his gleaming golden chariot, managed to shred and decimate the ranks of the Hittite army at the legendary Battle of Kadesh. It was the ultimate account of a crushing victory, a triumph so absolute and unquestionable that official history, academics, and textbooks bought this version for centuries on end without blinking an eye. After all, who would dare doubt the words recorded so methodically and grandly by antiquity's most revered ruler? But history, much like desert sand, has a relentless habit of revealing what's buried as soon as the winds shift. And the glaring problem for Ramses's legend is that on the other side of the ancient world, in the cold, rocky lands of Anatolia, the pickaxes of other archaeological digs began unearthing the secret archives of the Hittite Empire. Protected there, on ancient baked clay tablets that survived the ravages of time and the fires of collapsed civilizations, researchers found diplomatic and military data that clashed head-on with the pharaoh's spotless narrative. Far from all that Egyptian glitter and heavy state-funded propaganda, enemy records told a wildly different story. By the way, if you, like me, are fascinated by these inconvenient truths that history tried to sweep under the rug, go ahead and drop a like and subscribe to the channel, because what we're going to unearth today will completely change how you view the so-called heroes of the past. The undeniable fact brought to light by these excavations is that Ramses was a far cry from an untouchable god floating above mortal kings. The cold, hard documents reveal that he was, in reality, a flesh-and-blood commander, blinded by his own arrogance, who fell like a sitting duck into the oldest, most basic counterintelligence trap in military history. The dark mystery he worked so tirelessly to hide for over 3 millennia wasn't just a bitter defeat or a miscalculation in the heat of battle. The rabbit hole went much deeper. We're looking at a meticulous and ruthless bureaucratic operation to silence the survivors of his own army, rewrite the harsh reality of the facts in real time, and, through the sheer force of the state, shove a grand illusion carved in solid granite down the throat of an entire civilization. If you support this kind of content, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment your name and age. I read all the comments. Arrogance is usually the ultimate blind spot for men who think they're untouchable. It's an invisible trap for leaders who can no longer tell the difference between their own PR and the brutal reality of the battlefield. And with Ramses II, the story was no different. The pharaoh marched out of Egypt at the helm of a formidable war machine, the largest expeditionary force ever assembled in his reign. Divided into 4 massive armies, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, he was absolutely blinded by his own legend, truly believing he would wipe the Hittites off the map without breaking a sweat. The logistics of moving tens of thousands of men across the desert was already a monumental nightmare for the era. But the Egyptian leader drove the vanguard with a haste that bordered on reckless, thirsty for quick glory. During this grueling march, scouting patrols ended up intercepting 2 local Bedouins. After intense interrogation, these nomads handed over the exact news every commander dreams of hearing. They reported that the colossal Hittite army, led by the cunning King Muwatalli II, was terrified by Ramses's approach and had frantically retreated far away from the fortress of Kadesh. Any military strategist worth their salt would know that intel falling from the sky in hostile territory demands absolute skepticism. But Ramses, drunk on his own vanity and suffering from pure confirmation bias, swallowed the bait hook, line, and sinker. He simply didn't subject this intelligence to the necessary rigor, ignored safety protocols, and committed the ultimate sin of leadership. He brutally underestimated his opponent's intellect. Believing the city of Kadesh was practically abandoned and ripe for the picking, the pharaoh picked up the pace of his main division, dangerously separating himself from the rest of his forces. The other 3 divisions, weighed down by weapons and chariots under the punishing Middle Eastern sun, were left miles behind, completely shattering the tactical cohesion and support of the troops. He had stretched the empire's defense line to its absolute breaking point, all to reap the spoils of victory alone. But there was a dark detail the Egyptian spy network failed to catch in time. The intel handed to Ramses was a masterclass in deception. Those 2 ragged Bedouins weren't terrified informants trading secrets for the pharaoh's mercy. They were suicide spies, pawns in a lethal game of psychological chess, planted by the Hittite High Command with a single mission: to feed the Egyptian king's ego until he walked blindly, straight into the slaughterhouse. While Ramses ordered his men to set up camp with absurdly lax discipline, without even digging trenches or setting a guard perimeter, the reality outside was chilling. The Hittite army hadn't retreated a single inch. On the contrary, they were right there, just a few miles away, silently hidden behind the massive hill of Kadesh itself. 40,000 enemy soldiers and thousands of heavy chariots waited in dead silence, ready for the carnage. The Hittite king had played his cards perfectly, patiently waiting for Ramses's division to get trapped and vulnerable. The living god, resting in his tent, had no clue that the jaws of the ancient world's greatest ambush were wide open right around him. And it was in that exact moment of complacency, as campfires were being lit and armor taken off, that an unprecedented disaster knocked on his door. The lazy silence of the Egyptian camp, bathed in a false sense of security, was torn apart, not by a war cry, but by a deep, rolling rumble that made the sand shake. The initial Hittite attack wasn't an honorable battle formation. It was a systematic culling, a bloodbath designed to dismantle the enemy before they even realized they were under attack. While the Amun division dropped its guard, the Ra division was still in open march miles behind, trudging exhausted under the blistering sun with their shields down. And it was exactly at this vulnerable weak point, the soft flank of this moving column, that King Muwatalli delivered the kill shot. From behind the hill hiding Kadesh, a tidal wave of 2,500 heavy Hittite chariots crashed down like an avalanche of wood, bronze, and fury. And here lay a crucial military detail. Unlike Egyptian chariots, which were light and built for fast skirmishes with 2 men, Hittite vehicles were robust shock platforms manned by 3 armed warriors. Their goal wasn't to shoot arrows, it was to run over, crush, and irreparably split the enemy army right down the middle. The physical impact of this charge was brutal. The heavy chariots tore through the lines of the Ra division with the absurd ease of a scythe cutting through ripe wheat. There wasn't even time to form classic shield walls. In a matter of minutes, thousands of Egyptian soldiers were slaughtered in the desert, ground to dust beneath bronze wheels before they could even draw their swords. Panic spread like wildfire, and the traumatized survivors, in an act of pure animal instinct, ran blindly toward the only place that seemed to offer any shelter: Ramses's camp. The problem is, by doing so with such desperation, they brought hell itself right to his doorstep. The chaotic mass of fleeing men dragged the murderous Hittite vanguard straight into the royal tents, turning the sanctuary of the living god into ground zero of a massacre. Up until that fateful afternoon of dust and blood, Ramses II had lived comfortably inside the bubble of his own state propaganda. He was the untouchable deity, the supreme monarch to whom generals bowed, and whose name was whispered in awe. But when the screams of agony invaded his private tent and the metallic stench of hot blood hit his nostrils, that divine aura melted instantly under the crushing weight of enemy infantry. For the first time in his life, the pharaoh looked around and saw the structural collapse of his world. His elite guard, made up of Egypt's most formidable warriors, was literally being butchered just yards away. The makeshift barricade had been smashed, tents were up in flames, and every logical escape route was already blocked by chariots methodically closing the net. And it was in this exact moment of sheer desperation that the untouchable ruler had to take the most human, visceral action of his existence. The man who demanded the blind worship of millions had nowhere left to run. With no high-ranking generals to bark orders at and no organized army to protect him, Ramses had to throw on his armor in a panic, draw his own weapon, and climb into his chariot. Driven purely by a primal instinct for survival, he had to fight personally, covered in soot and sweat, hacking like a madman amidst the deafening chaos, just to keep his throat from being slit right there in the Syrian sands. The monarch with an unshakable aura was trading frantic blows like a common foot soldier, watching his brothers in arms bite the dust. The spotless invulnerability the state peddled so hard had been shattered into a million pieces. However, while Ramses fought blindly for his life in the eye of this hurricane of blades, the relentless Hittite war machine made an inexplicable tactical blunder, driven by the purest, most base greed. And this completely flips the script on what we know about the outcome of this bloodbath. As the Hittites ravenously stormed the pharaoh's wealthy camp, they stumbled upon loot the likes of which they hadn't seen in years. That fleeting fascination with gold opened a vital military loophole in a siege that seemed airtight. The momentary greed of the Hittite warriors, suddenly mesmerized by the gleaming gold and untold riches scattered across the fallen royal tents, provided the crucial window of opportunity that saved the pharaoh from a tragic end. While the lethal enemy vanguard lost its tactical cohesion to chaotically pillage the Egyptian camp's treasures, Ramses managed to catch his breath for a brief second and rally the few remaining fragments of his personal guard. It was in this exact moment of enemy disarray and euphoria that a stroke of pure tactical luck and a staggering twist of fate changed the course of that bloody afternoon forever. An elite Egyptian force, perfectly trained and marching independently along a parallel coastal route, not even part of the four main divisions, arrived on the battlefield completely by surprise. This unexpected backup slammed violently into the Hittite chariots crowding the loot, forcing them into a hasty retreat and finally breaking the deadly chokehold, squeezing the life out of Egypt's supreme ruler. Thanks to this providential military intervention, Ramses dodged certain death on the battlefield. Or, what would have been infinitely worse for his holy image, being captured alive and dragged like a humiliating human trophy back to the enemy capital. Yet, the naked truth is that he was forced to stage a bitter, exhausting, and deeply shameful retreat back to his own territory, leaving the mighty fortress of Kadesh firmly in the hands of King Muwatalli II. In any serious military academy in the world, or under the critical lens of any rigorous historian, that Syrian campaign was a strategic failure of absolutely catastrophic proportions. It was an imperial expedition that wiped out thousands of lives, nearly cost the pharaoh his head, and bled the state coffers dry, all without achieving a single one of its original goals. The massive problem was that the mighty Egyptian state, methodically built on the unquestionable divine premise of its supreme leader, simply did not allow for flawed gods or defeated military commanders. As he finally set foot safely in the monumental capital of Thebes, Ramses knew full well that the internal political fallout would be devastating and irreversible if the truth of the slaughter ever reached the ears of the high nobility and the people. To guarantee his political survival on the throne and keep his unshakable aura of power intact, he immediately fired up the full weight of the empire's formidable bureaucratic machine. In that moment, he launched what could easily be considered the first massive, systematic disinformation campaign in documented human history. The ruler didn't just omit the embarrassing facts. He bankrolled and engineered a monumental, deliberate distortion of reality on a continental scale. The pharaoh commissioned a tireless army of poets, scholars, court scribes, and the kingdom's most gifted stone carvers to work toward a single purpose: spinning his terrible tactical blunder and near-death experience in the desert into the most crushing, brilliant military victory the ancient world had ever witnessed. He ordered this fraud to be carved into the walls of the colossal temples of Karnak and Luxor. It was a power move that forced the people to bow down to the illusion every single day. The true mass media was stone, and Ramses held a monopoly on the quarries. The official narrative crushed reality under the undeniable weight of granite. But there was a deeply uncomfortable detail behind the scenes of this illusion machine. The most dangerous part of trying to rewrite an entire nation's history isn't convincing future generations. It's ruthlessly dealing with the men who were actually there in the dirt to witness the cold, hard facts. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers who survived the meat grinder at the Battle of Kadesh came back home alive, carrying in their memories not the image of an invincible god, but the trauma of an absolute massacre and the vivid recollection of a king fighting desperately for his own life in the dust and blood. How, after all, does a supreme leader neutralize an entire army of combat veterans without sparking an uncontrollable mutiny that could topple his dynasty? For Ramses II, the answer lay not just in brute force, but in a surgical and deeply corrupt bureaucratic overhaul of the entire Egyptian military high command. He knew the blood spilled in Syria had to be quickly staunched, either with rewards or with summary executions. There was no middle ground for those who witnessed the fall of the great myth. Generals, captains, and high-ranking officers who showed any capacity for critical thinking, or who might at some point contradict the dazzling official story being chiseled into the temple walls, were quietly and methodically discarded. The perverse genius of the state machine lay in using the army's own initial incompetence as a weapon for a political purge. They disgraced seasoned military men under the convenient excuse of cowardice in combat and abandoning their ruler during the Hittite siege. Those who dared to whisper the military truth in the halls of the capital quickly vanished into the shadows of bureaucracy, while the heroic king's official narrative gained even more institutional muscle, mercilessly crushing any intellectual pushback. But there was a crucial catch in this complex internal cleanup operation. You can't just execute all the veterans of a campaign without completely crippling the empire's armed forces. For the key players who survived the tactical disaster and held enough sway over the troops to destabilize central power, Ramses rolled out a tactic far more efficient and insidious than death. He buried them under incalculable mountains of official perks. Survivors who agreed to keep their heads down and rubber-stamp the new version of events were handsomely rewarded. They received obscene amounts of gold, vast stretches of fertile land, and lifelong noble titles that locked in luxury for their families for generations. The pharaoh essentially used the massive state treasury to buy tangible reality, turning eyewitnesses of a battlefield meltdown into highly paid accomplices of a millennial government fraud. Silence about the atrocities committed and suffered at Kadesh quickly became the most profitable asset in all of Egypt. It was a dark pact where loyalty and lies were paid out in unimaginable wealth. The catch was, everyone involved knew the rigid rules of this deadly game perfectly. Anyone who gave in to the temptation of opening their mouth to restore the honor of the fallen wouldn't just lose their newfound social status, they'd inevitably lose their head to the royal executioner's blades. The empire was drowning in a golden silence, securing the ruler's spotless aura. And this totally flips the script on what we know about ancient diplomacy. Because out there, far from the Egyptian quarries, the geopolitical chessboard was brewing a humiliating confession that no monuments could ever erase. The final undeniable crack in Ramses's wall of lies didn't come from an explosive internal rebellion or a leak orchestrated by disgruntled generals. It came from the crushing, cold weight of international geopolitics. 16 years after the bloodbath at Kadesh, for over a decade and a half, the supposed great victor and absolute lord of the ancient world kept sending military expeditions to the Syrian region, desperately trying to break the Hittite Empire through the brute force of his armies. But campaign after campaign, he kept failing to trigger any meaningful structural collapse in the enemy's formidable defenses. Time, that relentless judge who can't be bribed with endless state gold, made it perfectly clear that the Egyptian war machine was incapable of crushing its rivals. Backed into a corner by this chronic mutual exhaustion, the draining of public coffers, and the terrifying growing threat of other emerging empires in the region, the pharaoh had to swallow his divine pride and sit down at the negotiating table. It was under this intense pressure that he signed what would go down in history as the first documented bilateral peace treaty known to mankind. The famous Treaty of Kadesh was not, from any analytical standpoint, the imposing document of a conqueror dictating ironclad rules to a subjugated people on their knees. It was the crystal-clear diplomatic reflection of a tense standoff between two exhausted superpowers locked in an unsustainable stalemate. What makes this agreement such a stunning and ironic blow to Ramses's propaganda is the exact material it was sealed on. While back in Egypt, the pharaoh ruthlessly kept ordering his artisans to carve fake reliefs of Hittite submission into the sacred stones of Karnak, the harsh international reality was working in the exact opposite direction, and it was formalized on a massive tablet of solid silver. This document, with copies in clay and metal traveling solemnly between the two great capitals, laid out terms of absolute equality and mutual respect. The agreement etched into that precious metal demanded in writing a pact of perpetual non-aggression, the immediate extradition of political defectors, and the most humiliating and bitter pill for the gargantuan ego of a living god to swallow. It established a joint military defense alliance. This stipulated that if either empire were attacked by a third party, the other had an unavoidable obligation to send its own troops to protect them. That cold silver tablet, meticulously engraved in cuneiform, was the ultimate international legal confession of the brutal strategic tie that Egypt's majestic, towering walls refused to show. For the mighty Egyptian monarch, signing that piece of metal meant the hard, silent acceptance that his military might had hard limits. Ramses realized, with a chilling and almost terrifying pragmatism, that he had to bow diplomatically to his greatest foreign adversary just to stop his elaborate domestic illusion from crumbling entirely. By sealing a lasting peace with the Hittites and finally stopping the military bleeding at the borders, he brilliantly ensured his own people would keep believing he reigned supreme as the sole master of the world. And it was this sadistic genius that laid the groundwork for the historical fraud that would echo for millennia to come. Ramses II secured his immortality, etched into the annals of mankind's destiny, not because of flawless military precision or undeniable bravery in the chaos of war, but because of his purely wicked, calculating genius in controlling the flow of information across an entire empire. He understood, with a pragmatic clarity that bordered on cruelty, a brutal premise of human psychology that governments would continue to exploit for millennia. The naked truth doesn't survive the relentless test of time, but state-funded megalithic monuments do. When future generations stared in awe at the ruins of Egypt, they would never hear the desperate screams of Egyptian soldiers crushed by Hittite chariots, nor see the panic in the eyes of a king fighting for his life in the desert. They would only see the unshakable splendor of statues standing dozens of feet tall, swallowing that fabricated greatness as the undeniable record of material reality. The harsh reality of his total tactical collapse on the dusty plains of Syria was methodically crushed by the terrifying, everlasting weight of his own mortuary architecture, ensuring the government lie crystallized as an irrefutable historical fact. This is the masterful way the Egyptian state propped up its godlike aura of invulnerability at the cost of a colossal fraud, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the history of the world is rarely a faithful record of what actually went down in the trenches and the bloody heat of battle. Official history, at the end of the day, is just the sanitized version shoved down our throats by whoever has the power to grip the chisel the tightest and the endless wealth to bankroll the illusion for generations. Ramses had the incredibly shrewd foresight to know that the rival empire, with its clay tablets and classified diplomatic files, would inevitably crumble under the relentless weight of the ages, its secret archives buried in the deep darkness of Anatolia. Meanwhile, in complete contrast, the massive complexes of Luxor and Karnak would stand tall beside the waters of the Nile, defying the erosion of millennia and projecting forever into the future the airbrushed image of a monarch walking absolute and sovereign over the corpses of those who dared cross his path. This is the purest form of government deception engineering, the building of a social manipulation algorithm that survived not just the violent collapse of antiquity, but brilliantly fooled modern academic science for centuries, right up until that inconvenient silver treaty was finally dug up. This highly disturbing realization forces the modern viewer to look back at the past with a massive dose of skepticism and cold logic, methodically questioning everything we were taught to passively accept in school books. It makes it crystal clear that the biggest military embarrassments and the deepest political cowardices are often hiding in plain sight, heavily shielded by the blinding aura of a fake heroism that numbs our collective critical thinking. If this meticulous historical autopsy of the ancient world's greatest bureaucratic fraud shattered your conventional take on the greatness of the pharaohs, go ahead and drop a like right now and subscribe to the channel to catch our next investigations into the untold past. Because our relentless hunt to expose what the great monuments tried to silence is just getting started.